Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, the man who puts the law into Florodora. And that's a joke that's taken 120 years to mature, because, as I'm sure you know, Florodora originally opened in 1899. Well, today we're going to be looking at two very, very different shows, and yet shows which have a connected theme. Later on we'll be talking about 13 by Jason Robert Brown, but first we'll be looking at Bear, the Musical, by Damon Intrabartolo and John Hartmere. Now, in Britain at least, Bear is one of those shows which isn't widely known, generally, but does seem to be very widely known amongst the performance community, and certainly by students as well. It was originally called Bear, a pop opera, and it had its original run in Los Angeles in 2000. It then turned up again in New York in 2004, and was fully revised in 2011, when it was renamed as Bear the Musical. And it was in this form that I saw it a couple of years ago in Edinburgh. It's a striking show, based very heavily around and thematically linked with Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, which I think immediately tells you that it's going to be a tragedy. But it's a show that I think divides opinion, and to prove it, in a minute we'll hear a conversation that I had with Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted composer, and a friend of both of us, the very wonderful Ellen Armstrong, who's no slouch when it comes to understanding musical theatre. And as you'll hear in the conversation, we had very different takes on Bear the Musical, which I think just goes to show that it's perfectly possible to have different justified responses to the same source material. It would be absolutely terrible if everybody in the world had exactly the same emotional or intellectual response to any show, musical or otherwise. But one of the things I love about Musical Talk is discovering and exploring those differences of opinion. And remember, no view ever expressed on Musical Talk is authoritative. My view is only as good as yours. And if we differ, so be it. But I think we can all say that Bear has proven itself to be a long-term success and is a well-written and interesting piece. And it was only announced last year that there could well be a film of the musical. And whilst there's been no further news on that, it surely goes to show that the piece has potential. Well, that's enough of me rambling on. Let's hear that conversation I had with the lovely Ellen Armstrong, the equally lovely Michael Gordon Shapiro, and that utterly odious Thos Ribbits. That's me. Musical Talk. Well, I'm joined once again by Mike Shapiro, who is a great composer and a great friend, I hope, to talk more about one particular show that we saw in Edinburgh. But we're not alone.
We have a special guest visitor, a good friend of mine, someone with a degree in musical theatre and herself a accomplished performer of musical theatre with a lovely voice. I'm embarrassing her here and a way to prelude to her self-introduction.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ellen, and that was possibly the best introduction I've ever had.
Luckily, we've recorded it, so you can keep it.
Wonderful.
She's also my
ringtone.
She's my favorite kind of performer, namely one who's been in one of my shows. So she's forever in my heart in that role.
Now, we're here to talk about a show that's in Edinburgh this year. We haven't all seen it. Mike and I have seen it. Ellen, you know the piece, having listened to it previously. So we're coming at it from slightly different angles. And of course, Mike, you have a connection with it. The piece is Bear, B-A-R-E, and in a very thumbnail sketch, it's a High School Musical meets Romeo and Juliet, although that really is not at all what it is. That's just one or two of the tropes which are interwoven, perhaps, in some sense. High School Musical is not the right example here because it doesn't end happily.
Tonally, it's very different.
Yes. But it is. There's a high school element to it, an American high school, which I think cannot be underestimated in terms of cultural contextualisation and also cultural response, which, bearing in mind that we have several around the table, different cultures, might be quite interesting. But what's your connection with Bear?
It's only through having known the composer, Damon Intrabartolo, who was a colleague. We worked together in a couple of projects. He conducted orchestrally for me a couple of times. He was a very talented musician and composer and conductor. And unfortunately, the reason I'm using past tense is about 5 years ago he passed away, which was cutting a very promising career short very prematurely. But I knew him directly, and I knew some of his thoughts on the show because he discussed it with me while he was writing it. So this was my first opportunity to actually see the results of the show, to see the result of his hard work, and to see the show in final form.
In a live performance?
In live performance. Previously, I just heard some early demos, which really didn't give me a sense of how strong the show was.
I'm going to ask you, the two of you, if you can sort of briefly describe it, because I've obviously had a very ham-fisted attempt of doing so, which was really marking tropes rather than in any way describing the show. But Romeo and Juliet is thematically linked and actually linked with the plot.
Because there is a production of Romeo and Juliet at the center of the story, which also serves as a metaphor for a lot of the events within the story.
So it's a class of people in a Catholic school in America, isn't it? And they're into reactions.
And what's your take on the kind of big picture description of the story?
I think that's a fairly accurate summarization.
We have two characters whose names are...
Jason and Peter.
Jason and Peter, thank you. Who are secretly having a romance in the context of a Catholic school. And I assume this is meant to be in the late 90s or early 2000s.
90s is what I took from it, yes.
They updated one of the cultural references in the show a little bit, but I assume it was of that era. So the environment is not welcoming to gay relationships, to say the least. They're below the age of majority, among other things. That alone would get them in hot water in a Catholic school, letting aside the even bigger issue of the orientation. It's a high-stakes environment because one of the two, Jason, I believe he's got a scholarship to Notre Dame, when the implication is that could be threatened if the relationship is discovered. He has an abusive father, and it's made clear that he's going to get a beat down if the father discovers the relationship. On Peter's side, his mother is kinder, but she can't really deal with the relationship. She can't provide support.
She's an oddly weak woman, isn't she?
She is. Yeah. So there's a real sense of stakes here.
Also, Jason, if I may say, is, if you like, the high-profile student. He's, as you say, he's got the scholarship, but he's already, if you like, a jock in the broadest sense of that. You know, he's popular, he's handsome, all the girls want him, he's successful in everything. Or so it seems. What
I find interesting about the character, though, that differentiates him from the typical jock, is that you see a little bit of him presenting as the jock, and how it's an intentional, conscious effort on his part. Whereas I think normally when we see that stereotype, it's the
real
surface and there's nothing going on behind it.
Oh, so they're both images, but one is because it's not building on any foundation stones. This is the house of straw, whereas in this case, yes, it's a shield. But that idea of not being who you are is in fact one of the principal thematic pieces. In fact, and ultimately creates the final conflict. Is that going to be the best word? I don't know, but the final conflict between the two male characters in the piece, that one wants to be open and the other one does not. And then there's always going to be the question about who has the right to out anyone else, but who wants to live in the closet. That's a question that's being raised here. There's a lot more going on, though, isn't there?
There is. It's really the struggle of both members of this partnership to embrace the relationship fully and to figure out how to present that to the world, or whether or not to continue it in secrecy. And that becomes the real point of contention. There is also a host of secondary characters. We have Jason's sister, who is a bit of an outcast. There's the...
I think she's a goth character, really.
She's
quite miserable, with a sharp tongue.
With an acerbic wit, which is often targeted at, forgive me for the lack of names, I should have brought the program. There's a very sexually generous girl,
is that
I
Amy?
guess.
Ivy.
That sounds
Ivy.
right.
Yes, it's Ivy.
She is portrayed as kind of a wanton character and very cruel to her own boyfriend. And at the same time, she's presented very sympathetically because she develops feelings for Jason, and then runs into the problem of not being able to follow through with those feelings. And whereas she is normally the one who rejects the admiring boys, suddenly she is the rejected one. And what's fascinating here is that she, like many other characters, can be simultaneously portrayed as a villain and a sympathetic character, and I think that's a real accomplishment of the writing.
I find that really interesting because I have no sympathy for her at all.
You see, I think she's massively insecure, and that's why she's constantly looking for validation by having lots of boyfriends.
Absolutely.
And I do find that, I think the way she behaves is appalling, but I think there is some kernel of sympathy possible to her because of her damage.
It could be if it wasn't so irritating. when you have that same thing repeated.
She is ultimately a selfish character, though. I think we will have to touch on some of the plot twists and turns here, so there is a spoiler alert now. She gets pregnant, and Jason dies. Those are the two principal. Those are big spoilers. So, and I noticed that whereas a lot of people lament the passing of Jason afterwards, she is immediately poor me. And you think, well, suddenly you're not the story here anymore, dear. Not we should sound too patronising, but that's not what that's. She's sort of missing the point at the end, I think.
She is a functional character in the plot in that she provides Jason with an escape.
Reductive.
Well, she is a plot complication, basically.
Yeah.
She tempts Jason and gives him an escape route and camouflage.
Camouflage, yeah.
For the fact that he's gay. And
particularly when things start getting, speech marks, hot in terms of having to hide.
Right, exactly right. He and Peter are reaching this impasse as to the publicity of their relationship. So he escapes into this affair with Ivy. So from that standpoint, she's a plot complication. But she is also given vulnerabilities. There's an interesting issue here is how does a musical sell you on an unlikable character? A character who has no actual virtues whatsoever, and the only thing they can offer you is suffering. And I think the answer to that is in song. I think a sufficiently I don't want to say heart-tugging, but a sufficiently powerful ballad or confessional moment in song, although it can't earn you admiration, can't earn the character admiration, it can earn sympathy, which
and
might
empathy,
not
yeah.
otherwise be possible. And I think that does happen here.
Again, I'm going to disagree. With her solo Portrait of a Girl, I'm not inclined to feel any sympathy for her, but I think it's very useful as a plot point for you to then elevate Jason's own struggle with hiding, because you have the same theme of hiding behind something that you're not, but because hers is so superficial and uninteresting and selfish, his becomes grounded and interesting and real, and you have a connection to him by comparison.
So she's actually the kind of jock you're saying that you normally get, which is the jock who's all front and no behind, as it were. She's all, in this case, sexual advance and hard edges, but actually underneath it you're saying there isn't very much to find. Are you saying that?
I'm not sure I go that far. It's her self-centeredness, and when you were saying before about her being the centre of the story, hang on a minute, it's not your story here. Yes. I felt all the way through she was trying to make it her story.
So in her case, it's bare-faced cheek rather than just bare. But
it's irritating.
Well, can I ask about Peter then? Because I think the show at the beginning sort of makes Peter the central character, or you seem to be lured down that path, and then I don't think he is. I think it's actually all about Jason. Or it's ostensibly about Jason. And actually, I'm not sure Peter's a very sympathetic character either. He's very demanding. I mean, I begrudge no one wanting to come out of the closet, but there's a little throwaway line where they've only got 3 months left at school. And you think, well, can't you wait 3 months, bearing in mind it is going to involve your boyfriend being thrashed to the 7 corners of the earth? Surely another 12 weeks isn't going to make that much difference when you've got the rest of your life ahead. But he seems to be I've made up my mind and this is what's going to happen. And actually, if you can't come to terms with that, then it's all off. I didn't like Peter either.
It's very interesting because I found him to be utterly sympathetic, and the actor was obviously older than the role, so there may have been some dissonance between the physicality of the person and the character in this particular production. But I saw him as a hard-on-sleeve, smitten in love high school student who does not have the emotional resources or patience or perspective. He's struggling with his orientation, which has and all the societal disapproval he's facing. He's probably insecure in that Jason doesn't seem to be as wholeheartedly embracing the relationship as he does.
Although it's very clearly a sincere relationship.
It is.
So I think he's pretty lucky, actually, in some ways, for a speech-marked closeted gay man to actually have bagged the jock successfully. It's not. It's not the worst story I've ever heard for a person.
Right. So he doesn't appreciate what he has in some senses, but I think he's nervous and desperate to preserve and he's in love. So I connect with that. And musically, again, I just want to stress that the emotional brunt of the story is not from these abstract descriptions of the characters. It's you feel it when you hear them sing. That is the details in which all the devil is. And a lot of times I'm brought around to see Peter's point of view or a point of view of another character just because I find their songs so convincing and musically powerful. And so for that reason, I did connect to Peter, even though he's not omnipotent. He doesn't quite know how to manage the relationship. He does have a panic response. He has a hallucination of Britney Spears in this case.
That's the updated reference, isn't it?
Right. It was, I think, Diana Ross originally.
Good Lord. And Judy Garland in the 1950s version.
But I really was carried along with him, and at the same time, I did transfer over to Jason as the protagonist because he's the one with the real decision.
Yeah.
And at the point where
and
Peter,
jeopardy. He's got real jeopardy.
Right. He's the most to lose from this decision. So it's a much bigger hurdle for him because if he comes out and publicly admits to being in a relationship with Peter, he's going to lose potentially his scholarship. His family life is going to fall apart. He may be subject to martial punishment from his father, and the whole opera, and it is billed as an opera, is racing to this decision point. The stakes are higher because Peter's kind of given up on the relationship at this point, and Jason has to basically do or die. And as you said, he dies in a way that's very logically connected. I guess we're spoiling everything, but he basically takes uppers or a mix of drugs to give him the courage to come out and propose this to Peter. And this was cleverly planted before because there was a whole rave episode where the drugs were introduced to us, so they're not coming out of the blue. And there's a parallel to Romeo and Juliet where medicinals are used to ill effect to try to bolster a doomed relationship. And the details are completely different, but you see him going down a tragic path in the name of a good cause. So I was connected to both these characters for all their flaws.
I'd like to ask you a question here. This is such a reductive question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who is the big bad in Bear?
Societal attitudes towards homosexuality, both in the mockery of the real imagined mockery of peers. There's the imagined consequence of Jason coming out and his father's thrashing him and perhaps losing his scholarship to Notre Dame. A lot of this is implied rather than shown, but I find it very convincing that if they come out, there's going to be hell to pay. I believe that.
And you?
I have to agree. There's not a central figure. It's the attitude. It's the idea, the ideology.
You see, the thing that surprised me is it's billed, or certainly the description on the online catalogue, is that it is, it's a gay love story in the context of a Catholic school. And you obviously think that the Catholic school and the Catholic faith is going to be the villain here. And certainly it supports the structure of society as it is. It's a leading proponent of non-equality in that sense. But actually, the odd thing about it is the Catholic school is actually merely a backdrop. I mean, it's a dreadful school. The amount of dreadful things those kids, as a group, that cohort that year were dreadful. They're drug taking. They steal the school van to get to the rave, which is illegal. They shouldn't have been going to anyway. The place is awash with drugs in the building as well. Apparently, Ivy gets pregnant. There's sex everywhere. Of all types, it's all comers, if you pardon the expression. The discipline in that school is appalling, and it may be. But the odd thing about it is you expect the Catholics. That's shorthand for authoritarian rule, isn't it? And that's what you expect, and you don't get that. You only actually see sort of two characters representing the church and the school themselves. There is the ineffectual priest, and he's a minor character, and his principal role is to fail Jason and then be confronted by Peter at the end on behalf of society against the church, liberal society against the church. But actually his role is to be a weak priest, and that's a well-trodden path, and that's funny enough, that's his humanity, ironically. He is a failed man. But that's not the church, that is him as an individual. And then there is, if you like, the teacher, who I think is principally she also is the drama teacher who's running the amateur dramatics class of Romeo and Juliet, who turns out to be surprisingly liberal when the time comes. And you think, well, obviously, so she's not bad at all.
It is the drama department.
Yeah, well, yes, I suppose it does go with the territory. But, she's very sympathetic and helpful to Peter when he's having one of his crises. In fact, rather more so than the weak priest. So, actually, in the piece, the Catholic Church is actually more or less ignored. It's almost a shorthand for an environment that they're living in, but the representation of it turns out not to be the villain. Well, that's the way I read it. And the only villain I could latch onto was Off, who is the father. That is clearly what drives Jason's fear, that he's going to be beaten to a pulp. It is, you're right, there's also the added elements of society's rejection, both within the school and the loss of a potential future, etc., etc. So I absolutely understand his fear of coming out, but it seems to be, the thing that seems to drive him most is his familial circumstances. So I sort of wonder what the point of the Catholic Church in the thing actually is. Sorry, but it's a question more than or an observation more than an...
I think it's useful, like you say, it's a shorthand and it's something that's instantly recognisable.
Yeah.
So as soon as we set it there, we know what the attitudes are.
We've got a context, I suppose.
Yeah, we don't need to see them. We don't need to go into depth. We have that connotation already.
Thos, that was so well argued that I'm going to revise my answer to the question. I think the real villain of the show, or the antagonist is a better term, are Jason and Peter's own fears of the future. Because the real challenge here is primarily for Jason to overcome his fear of ostracism, of peer rejection, of abuse, physical abuse from his father and his future, and to have the courage to say, yes, I love you, and I'm going to stand up for that love. And that was his struggle. And the tragedy, the thing that makes this an operatic tragedy, is that it's too little too late. And by the time he does it, and the way he does it, everything's lost. And I really appreciated this because as we were closing in on the end, I was anticipating a happy ending.
Were you?
I absolutely was.
How did you miss the word opera?
They're operatic comedies.
Yeah, there are. Yes.
It was really telegraphing a positive ending. You started to hear the song. You started to hear I'm coming out of the closet, I'm going to declare my love for you song. And the musical character of that song, whose name I don't remember, but it's probably the second or third last song on the show, was so pronounced that I immediately said, okay, this is the moment I've been waiting for. He's going to stand up in the middle of Romeo and Juliet, and they're going to sabotage the play just so they can announce their love for each other. And I have actually heard, I'm coming from a perspective of having heard the early demos of this show, so I believe there was a happy ending and an early incarnation that may have influenced my perception like 20 years later. I may have carried that memory with me, but I was so ready for that. I wanted that to happen. I needed to see that relationship work. And I actually think the tragic ending is much less effective than the positive ending would have been. So to turn it back to your question, I think this is a story of trying to overcoming fear and the perils of giving in to pressure and cowardice and running from the thing you truly love and how that can backfire.
See, I come from this as a cynic. As soon as I see a gay story, I anticipate death.
If I see Romeo and Juliet ever mentioned in any play
death.
whatsoever,
Death
I
is
also
happening.
expect death. Yes, quite. You used the word telegraph. That is walking across the room, balancing a broom on your nose. That's look at me, waving 3 American flags as the song goes. So yes. Can I ask you a different question? And I think this is the one I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about different cultural responses to a play, a show which I think is very American. It's very American in tone, very American in feel. Nothing wrong with that. We're very used to that. And I used wrongly as shorthand a High School Musical, but in that sort of slightly shorthand for America, or American culture, and school culture in particular, the emotional pitch of the show. Now, if you were asking me how I would describe this in a simple buzz phrase, I would say it's an MTV musical, because I found it quite histrionic. I thought it almost immediately went into lots of emotional songs about every single emotion each of these adolescent characters were feeling. And let's face it, we're all adolescents. We all remember what that was like. There was quite a lot. Well, there was much ado about nothing, if you don't mind me saying. There is, in the sense that they went immediately to, I'm emoting about this, and now I'm feeling this, and I'm going to emote about that very thoroughly, and therefore I thought it was quite difficult to see an emotional pitch rise as we headed inexorably, or not, to the tragedy.
Which is another reason why you can cut Ivy's song. We don't need it.
Really just have it out for her, don't you?
It's more emotional self-love.
Well, yes, it's certainly self-love. I think. There's an old British song called I'm Going to Cling to Ivy If Ivy Will Cling to Me, which seems at least worth mentioning, if nothing else. I draw nothing from it. It's by Vivian Ellis, I think, if you're interested. Anyway, carry on.
I would actually believe that the name choice was deliberate, not necessarily as an allusion to that song, but the same idea, someone clinging. So that's an interesting observation.
There's also Poison Ivy, isn't there? There's another famous song from a slightly, 50s, isn't it?
We may be overthinking a character who is definitely secondary and mostly there to make things worse for the main characters. I maybe just approaching this from too optimistic a vantage point, because addressing your earlier point, in retrospect, yes, the tragic ending was as widely advertised as we could expect, given the integration of Romeo and Juliet, given everything else. I so wanted to see that happy ending. I guess I was blind to maybe some of the obvious signs, and again, I might have been remembering the early demos. With respect to the tone, this show was written in the wake of Rent.
Yes.
And there's a very strong influence. I actually know that just from speaking to Damon, but you can just tell by the musical stylization, the what I'll call the acoustic indie rock musical vocabulary, and also the very specific way that music and lyrics intertwine. There's a tradition that Rent really brought to the forefront where phrases of everyday life were musicalized, and you could hear how the rhyme scheme would always pivot at a certain point.
There's no real dialogue in Bear, is there?
There's some, but quite a bit of pedestrian dialogue is musicalized, and I think that contributes to why it calls itself an opera. I do appreciate the over-the-top, ultra-romantic view of the emotional volatility of the American high school experience. I totally get it, where everyone going out to a rave is like the biggest thing in the world, and every breakup is the biggest thing in the world. And when we see a couple of moments of Ivy's beleaguered boyfriend, he's like pounding his fist on the ground, and his life is falling apart. In real-life terms, this is just a transient high school relationship, but at that age, these are huge moments. And I think the slightly histrionic approach to the music, to me, makes sense.
And yet, you'll understand, forgive me, culturally I find that quite difficult to engage with, because, I come from a world of cynicism and reserve, where actually, people didn't have screaming arguments at the prom. We all ignored each other at the school disco and just ate crisps in the corner with our same gendered friends. I mean, that's how that worked, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I'll admit there may be something lost in translation, and I also acknowledge there may
we're low rent in this country rather than rent, I think.
Well put. There are some ballads that could have been omitted from a story standpoint. Jason's sister, who is a very funny character, has a lament. As you said, Ivy has essentially a lament that we don't absolutely need to hear. And I'm usually not very forgiving of ballads in particular that are not tied to the plot. For me personally, I do not begrudge anyone an opinion that the show was half an hour too long or dwelled too long in secondary characters. Those are totally valid, because I've made those complaints about other shows. For me, the show had such relentless momentum that, and part of this came from, I think, being through sung for most of its part, that I was carried through those moments and didn't object to them. And I didn't object to the heightened emotionality of high school students, because it rang
felt very
true.
sincere to me.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree.
Well, that's interesting, because you said the word relentless, and I find relentless in an emotion very difficult to stomach. So I think you've hit upon the word.
See, I think I agree. You need breaks from it, you need pauses from it, but that's actually where the secondary characters come in useful, because if they haven't really potentially earned the right to a solo at that point, you do disengage a little, and it gives you that breathing space so that when the central characters come back in, you're focused on them again.
I'm just briefly going to mention another thing, and this is a throwaway in a way, but there was a lovely song when Peter tries to phone his mother to come out to her, and she refuses to take or have that conversation. And it was beautifully acted on the performance, I thought. Very moving, actually. And then she sings a song which is basically, I've had no warning to get ready for this. I know it's coming, but I'm not, But earlier on in the plot, it was made very plain that she'd sent her son to the Catholic school in the first place because he was a bit too interested in makeup. So she had plenty of warning. She'd had 10 years. So actually, what that did, it showed that she was weak, but it was very difficult to feel sympathy for her at that point. I felt sympathy for her when I understood why she didn't want to take the call. And there was a very, very deft line, and I can't remember how it was written, but it was about, the hopes and dreams I had for my family have to be put aside, because then that's not the path that's going to be taken. It was something to that line. But then she sang this ridiculous song about how, once again, it's all about her. She wasn't ready for it. But that, the warning, all the warnings were there, to be honest. It was like a 15-minute warning rather than a 3-minute one, in my view. But this is nitpicking, because I thought the performance, but that's a good example of an emotional song that didn't deserve to be there, because or change the dialogue earlier.
I agree, and I think the reason the other ballads worked better for me is because we felt affection to the characters for other reasons. The goth sister was very funny, and she was also digging at the it's a good term that's diplomatic, the portrayed as slutty character. She's making all these
popular
funny...
girl.
The popular girl. Like there's a moment where they're both together in Romeo and Juliet, and the teacher says, I think she's playing a nurse, the sister's playing a nurse, and the popular girl is playing Juliet, I believe. And then the teacher warns the sister, the nurse doesn't slap Juliet, by the way. And then she does it anyway, and she says, I just really feel that there was a slap there. It's a hysterical moment. Yeah. So we feel affection for her, even though she's not instrumental to the plot. So I feel her song was more earned, but you're absolutely right. We're not attached to the mother. She's kind of a villain for being cowardly, and that is a song that we could have cut.
And therefore there is a danger if every character gets an emotional song or two, and every character does seem to get an emotional song or two, it can feel a little stodgy, in my view. But you know, I'm not here to slam it down. There was a lot to like in it. There was a lot to like in it. It's just that I felt that I found it quite difficult to engage with at an emotional level, and that is the very level at which it requires me to engage with it.
There are similar complaints lobbied against Rent, and I have friends who love Rent and some friends who say this is a bunch of whining losers with no job. And
I'm afraid I'm in category 2.
I intellectually agree with category 2, but yet I emotionally belong to category 1. For some reason, Rent hit home with me. I think the story here is better. I think there's a real conflict. The characters are really struggling. We sympathize with them. And there are two virtues that I want to bring to the foreground. I'll do very quickly, but lyrically and dialogue-wise, this show is crackling. The lyrics and dialogue are really smart and true to life. And musically, I think this is just a great example of this genre of rock and pop. And it's very enjoyable just on a musical level as well. And this is one of the first things a casual listener is going to experience, and we've saved this for the very end. But it's a great listen, even if you don't have a chance to see it. So I recommend it for that reason.
So, well, can I thank you both, Ellen and Mike, for... I think it's been actually a very interesting three-way conversation because we've all taken this in very different approaches from our different experiences of it. And actually, in that sense, that makes it a great show because actually we're all taking different take-homes, if that makes sense. So for the time being, but I hope that we can continue conversing on other occasions at other fringes, thank you so much for your fabulous conversation about Bear.
Likewise. This has been fun as always.
Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Well, there we are. Mike Shapiro, Ellen Armstrong and myself discussing Bear, and coming to it, and indeed from it, in very different ways, none of which were right or wrong. Now, the next show we're going to be talking about is at least thematically connected with Bear the musical. It's called 13. It's a well-known musical by Jason Robert Brown, and one of the ways it's linked is, of course, that both shows are about being accepted or fearing non-acceptance in a group of peers, although they both have very different outcomes when you compare the two pieces. But there are other links, because it's easy to forget that the Romeo and Juliet story that Bear is based on and connects itself to is about two lovers who were 13. Yes, that's the age that Romeo and Juliet were both supposed to have been in the original by William Shakespeare. And 13 is a very significant age. It is, of course, the beginning of your teenage years, and for both boys and girls, it's the time puberty strikes and you transition into your adult life. Therefore, it's hardly surprising that it's been the basis of a whole number of musicals over the years. In a minute, we'll be talking about 13, which really couldn't set out its stall more clearly from its title. But in the last month alone, I have seen 3 musicals in London, all mining the same theme. One was The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, aged 13 3/4, by old friends of this programme, the very talented Jake Brunger and Pippa Cleary, and directed by the excellent Luke Shepherd. And that was a great success across the country, including London. I enjoyed it very much. Now, Adrian Mole is a boy who is, as we know, 13 3/4. But I also saw Falsettos by William Finn at the Other Palace, where one of the significant characters is a boy who is concerned about turning 13 and having a bar mitzvah. And then I saw Big by John Weidman, with a score by David Shire and Richard Maltby. In my view, a very good score, actually. I was very impressed. And of course, that's also about a boy turning 13. He just happens to be in an adult's body at the time, but it all hinges on his 13th birthday. And the only musical I need to add to my collection to get the full works, as far as I can see, is The Bar Mitzvah Boy by Julie Stein. Sadly, not in London this year, as far as I can see. So, it's been a great year if you want to see musicals about turning 13. But let's get back to the main one. Or at least the main one for the purposes of today's episode. 13 by Jason Robert Brown. A show first performed in Los Angeles in 2007, made it to Broadway in 2008, and first came to London in 2012. I caught it for the second year in a row, I should say, at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2019. And after the performance, I sat down with the producer for the theatrical company putting it on, called Captivate Theatre, Sally Lyle. And let's hear that conversation now. Musical Talk.
My name is Sally Lyle and I am the director of Captivate Theatre. We're an Edinburgh-based company. We run shows throughout the year, but we do an awful lot within the Fringe for the full 3 weeks.
Yeah, you are incredibly busy. I've learnt this very day that you've got, I think, 4 shows running one after the other in one venue here in Edinburgh.
Yeah, we have 4 shows in the main space. We've also got a show downstairs in the basement. We also have shows at the Pleasance and the museum. So, yeah, it's not just the Rose.
So I'm very grateful to catch you on your way to the hospital. Or at least a sanatorium, yes.
Yes, no, it has been a very full-on few weeks. But.
And before we even started this conversation, you were actually talking about how busy the run-up to it is, because anyone who's ever been involved in putting on a show at any level will know that actually it's the invisible work that gets done before you get on stage, which is the hard work. And when you win or lose the battle, to do that with 5 or more shows in succession. I made a joke about hospital, but actually you're still smiling and conscious mentis. It's very
Yes,
impressive.
I am. I mean, last week was hard when we're finalising all the rehearsals, getting everything together, doing all the admin as well. So there were times I was going to bed at 2 and I was up at 6.
Gosh, yeah.
Just to try and get through it all. But once the shows are up and running, then things are an awful lot easier.
Yes, once the boat's in the middle of the river, you only have to prod it away from the edges occasionally. That's the kind of thing. But we're here to talk about a particular show I've just seen, and it is 13. Now, 13 is a fairly well-known piece, an American piece, and indeed I saw it up here in Edinburgh last year with a separate company, I think. So it has a pedigree, and I can see why people choose it, because it's excellent. Your production today was fantastic, highly enjoyable. But tell me, if you don't mind, how did you sort of alight upon 13? And I suppose, well, let's see where that takes us, because I think there are some interesting questions that must come out of that. But
yeah, I mean, we actually did perform 13 last year in the Rose as well, but we actually had an older cast. I mean, they were older as in they were 15, 16.
It's probably your production I saw then.
Well, it could have been, though there was another one. Were you here?
No, that I can't remember. But that would make 26. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it'd be here, because often there's more than one production, and last year there was definitely more than one production in the Fringe. So last year we had sort of 15, 16-year-olds playing the main roles, because we just thought mature actors perhaps would cope with it better. But this year we went for 12, 13-year-olds, and they've done an amazing job. I think it resonates so much with them.
Yeah, I was trying to work out the ages as you do, and I would have said the principals are all about 15, 16.
Yeah, no,
so I'm
they
wrong.
they are mostly 13, 14.
How precocious.
Yeah, I know. So talented.
So you picked 13 last year and this year. Is that because... Well, let's talk about your company. Is that because you want to be able to provide different opportunities for different age range?
Absolutely, and this provides a lot for that mid-age range, mid-teenagers. And we just loved it last year because it sold well. The people involved in it loved being involved in it, and it provides opportunities that also resonate for the kids. I just feel it's so right for what's happening to them in their lives at the moment.
This did lead on to the question I wanted to, which is how does one cast it? And it's interesting to me that you've actually done it in 2 different ways in 2 years.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. This is purely theoretical. Could you do it with an audience, with a cast of 20-year-olds?
I don't think it would work. I think they have to be experiencing what the children in the musical are experiencing.
It's the method.
Yeah, I just think, 20-year-olds, I think,
just
wouldn't
too far.
work.
It would give it a very
It would
different
look
slant.
rather ridiculous. We were talking today that we should write our own one called 30.
I'll come and see that. If you can ratchet it up another 20 years, I'll come and see that too. It's all very AA Milne, isn't it? Now we are 7 or whatever it is. Yeah, it's quite. So, describe for people who haven't come across 13, if you don't mind, just briefly the plot.
Well, it's about a boy called Evan who lives in New York. His parents split up and he moves to Indiana. And to begin with, he thinks he's living in the sticks. He'll never fit in. He tries to get in with the cool kids. And then by the end of it realises who his true friends are and is happily settled in his new domain.
That's a very nice and succinct way of describing it. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it is, at one level, it's the kind of thing you think, of course, that's what a musical for this age group is going to be about. But it is about finding your social identity. It's also got a heavy psychological overlay in that sense. I will say this, a number of the characters have a very sophisticated understanding of their predicament and who they are. And other characters, presumably the ones who are... But some of the characters are portrayed as less intelligent. Sail through their lives happily or unhappily, depending on what happens.
And don't learn anything, but yes, that's the plot.
But that does require a certain amount of knowingness, and it comes across from the narrative. How easy is it, therefore, to match the actors with the characters? I mean, if you're saying you've got 13, 14, 15-year-olds, it was 13 and 14 you were saying, is that right?
Yes, they're mostly
Principally.
13, 14, yeah.
Is there a gap of self-understanding in that age group, or do you think people are, how accurately does the thing portray a young person's life?
I think inevitably, yes, there are people with a lack of self-understanding.
Yeah. And they go through life, by the way, so you'll find them at 80 as well.
And they cause difficulties for people in real life. I have personal experience of family members who've been through a very hard time with people being cruel to them. So
sometimes unknowingly as well.
Often unknowingly.
Isn't it? Yeah, that's the biggest pain, I think, in society.
It's all being left out and people not realising they're leaving people out. But, you can see that it's painful for a lot of these young people.
One of the things I also find very interesting about the book of 13, if I may say, is... And it's an unusual thing. It allows for the plot to take place. It doesn't feel madly unnatural, but it is coincidental that almost all the characters of any note end up at some stage trying to act on behalf of other characters. There's an awful lot of deal making. I'll do it overtly in several cases. I will do this for you if you do this for me, or I can help you get to what you want, but I'd like you to, rub my back. Then even down to the sort of the principal jock character, before he's even met Evan, who's the principal protagonist, he has got his kind of sort of two henchmen, if you like, his two principal sidekicks, who he's instructing at the very beginning to set up dates for him. It's like he doesn't do anything. So everybody is levering everybody else for different purposes in different ways. Then that does allow for the meshing of the plot to get complicated and then unwrap itself again. But that's actually quite curious. Did you find, when putting the piece on, that you had to work on that element of it to make it seem realistic, or does the narrative just do that for you?
Well, it is all part of the narrative, and the piece actually this year was directed by Louise Hunter, who was involved in it last year as a choreographer and has taken over the directorship this year. So you'd need to know Louise is a director and Caitlin Morgan was a musical director. So they have been working with this group of people this occasion. So that would be a question for them, but I imagine the answer would be that, it is the plot. You go with the plot.
As the plot would have it.
Yeah, that's as the plot would have it. So, and in the end, the protagonists learn something, but not all of them do.
It's true, but the reason I dwell on it is because so often drama in all its senses, whether it's musical or otherwise, has this sense of finding the agency. A character without agency is a dull character, whereas a character that actually is prepared to act is an interesting character. What I therefore find interesting is there are lots of characters who are prepared to act, but are prepared to act for other people, often for slightly selfish... There's very few people acting for other people because it's altruistically, at least at first. I mean, as you say, it all boils down in the end. Yes, I suppose
it's only Patrice that doesn't get involved in all of that.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah, because Archie does. Yeah.
Although Kendra is fairly without agency, she's played upon rather than plays herself.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
I mean, it turns out that she's ultimately sufficiently vain for her not to realise what's going on. Whereas Patrice is the one who is the grand old observer of what's... She fully understands the circumstances she's in, and in a sense, Evan is the key to her salvation, but not necessarily through what he does, because actually she pulls the fat out of the fire for him a lot.
Yes, I suppose he goes on the journey.
Yes, it is his story,
she's already there. Has an understanding how it all works.
So, from your point of view, I'm not going to ask you to compare like with like, but having seen it in two different iterations over 2 years, what has opened your eyes through the different productions? What have you seen this year that you didn't see last year, and perhaps vice versa? And I'm not talking about quality, because the performing was excellent today.
Yeah, no, I think the performances both last year and this year were excellent.
Superb,
We had
yeah.
superb protagonists last year as well. I just think perhaps watching them when they are 13 and becoming a man, whatever, has just been that slightly more moving at the end. The last 2 songs always get me. If I
really?
sit and watch
You're
it,
touched by it still?
I am still touched by it. I just look at them all, and because I know them all so well, and they've sort of done Captivate theatre shows and Captivate drama for many years, and you sort of watching them coming to that age,
Fruition
becoming
almost,
a man, and it's just quite moving.
I'll tell you what's very interesting, and this is just a little aside. In the there's a kind of sort of walk-down number at the end where we sort of get a gratuitous song at the end just because it's fun and we like it.
Yeah, yes, there's a few of those in musicals.
Well, yes, it has been known, hasn't it? There's a bit at the end where they're all essentially sort of singing. It's an ensemble piece. They're singing and dancing. There's quite a lot of dabbing and pointing and and you can see, because they're slightly off the leash because they've finished the show, they're sometimes pointing at their mates or their friends. And so I saw at least one of the actors was pointing to a group of 3 girls, presumably he knows very well, in the audience during that. But what was lovely about that was, because it was the Evan character, actually.
Right.
We have seen him becoming a man, but we also got to see...
Him being himself.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what you saw was the 13 or 14-year-old boy coming through. So, funnily enough, it fused with the reality. It was actually very sweet and very charming at the end. Let's talk about the cast. Who is the actor who plays Evan? He's quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah, he's Andrew Gilbert. He's 13. He's done a number of things with us before.
I would have said he was 15, as I say.
Yeah, no, he's not. He's young.
Amazing, yes, quite.
And
so there's great maturity in his performance, actually.
Yeah. So he actually was our Oliver. Was he Oliver last year or the year before? Yeah. But then his voice went. He could no longer be Oliver.
Well, 13's good for that.
Yeah, so now because also 13 provide you with different keys to sing in. So
just in his character.
Yeah, and I think maybe Brett. I think it depends on where the voice is, and so that's really good that you can try it out in a couple of keys and see which one fits the best.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I think actually it's almost showboated or not showboated, but showcased might be a better way of doing it, because he's in the opening number. Obviously, it's his story. Obviously, everyone else comes on as well, but he's telling how he's getting to Indiana. And then the second number is a solo for him, and it seems to be, to my ear, on a lower register, and you suddenly think, oh yes, that is the teenage voice thing going on.
Yeah. I mean, poor boys at that age have a nightmare. Our Dodger at the moment...
I can tell you this is true.
Our Dodger at the moment is going to be doing Oliver. His voice is going now, so we're thinking, how do we do this? But that's for Fagin, a couple of weeks. Yeah. We'll come up with a solution, but it's so difficult for them.
Yeah. But he's on a lot.
Yes.
And that's quite a big ask. And the songs are very varied as well, and he's involved in a lot of those. There's a kind of 50s rock number.
Yeah, great music, I love it.
Yeah, it's extremely catchy and does what it needs to do, but some of the numbers are also extremely good musical theatre conceit numbers, so it's not just pastiches of different genres. There's a good musical theatre number. Indeed, a friend of mine I saw it with was pointing out he particularly liked this number, the one where Evan is singing with Archie being the disabled boy with special needs, and it's the song where Archie is persuading Evan's mother to allow him as...
no one says no to a boy with a terminal illness.
Yes, of course, it's all got a slightly cheeky
I know, it's when he first says that
it?
line, it's so funny.
But that's a good musical number as well, so it's got something for everyone. What do you like from the score? I mean, it's a stupid question, but actually I always think it's a very interesting one to see what do people latch onto, and you're so close to the production.
Yes, no, I'm so close. I suppose because I don't watch it in full every day. There are numbers I like, and there are numbers I like to pop in for. I love Hey Kendra. I think that's really funny. I really like No One Says No to a Boy with a Terminal Illness. I love the humour in that.
It's a bit Avenue Q, that one, isn't it, in that sense?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Let's confront this straight on. Actually, that Archie's really well written.
Yeah, no, it is. I absolutely love it. And and Seamus Cross, who plays Archie, I think is doing a fantastic job. And I love the cinema one. I think that's very funny.
Oh, the Screamfest, where there's different things. That's a good musical number in the sense that there's a lovely bit of context.
Yeah.
And things are happening at the same time, and it has a great denouement as well. A big important plot point occurs.
Yes.
By the way, I will congratulate you and your colleagues who have been involved in directing on that. I allowed myself to watch what all the cast members were doing in the cinema screening, because they're all sitting in rows as you'd expect, and you've got the principals at the front and some sidekicks in row 2 and other characters here and there, dotted here and there. And of course, the conceit is that they're watching this horror film, which is actually above the age range. They've been smuggled in essentially, and they're finding it a bit much. and several of them have got their mind on romance and the date that's looming or is in action. So you've got that double thing going on. You've got Evan and his plans hopefully unfolding in the way he wants to give him his social success. But I was watching during particularly the bits where all the other actors are being required to sort of watch the film as a backdrop for what's going on, and they're all doing marvellously. It's a real credit to your group that they've obviously been told react with your friends. You know, each of these characters there with their own mates in those circles that we aren't seeing, and they're all performing individually. It's not block performance; it's individual performance together to make an en masse piece. And it was lovely.
Now, we're very
so
impressed
much
with this group this year. Have been absolutely wonderful. You know, they're very well behaved in the dressing room. They managed to get themselves on and off stage without any fuss.
Self-start. Are you sure they're not 15, 16?
I know. I think they get worse when they're older.
You wait
and
till
then
they're
the
15.
adults, they make a terrible mess.
30 years in the business. So it's a lovely piece, beautifully performed. Who's your Patrice? As we've been naming some of the main actors.
we've got a double cast of the girls.
Oh, have you?
Patrice
you
today.
have a lot of girls in the cast.
We
as
do,
well.
and we always get so many more girls than boys. So we do like to give opportunities to more. So the girl characters are double cast. Patrice is Annie Knox. She's called.
And that was today's Patrice.
Yeah.
Who's rocking a dungaree set quite often.
I think she plays a part very perfectly.
Oh, she does as well.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting sort of. She's clearly a girl who's spent a lot of time introspecting, and that has given her great insight. And she's very appealing in that sense, even though she's nicknamed the Freak and it's terrible, and she's isolated. But let me ask culturally, because it is very culturally American. Nothing wrong with that per se, and we've all got a finger in the American teen culture. We've all seen High School Musical. We all know a little bit that it seems to revolve almost entirely around prom, and in this case we don't have a prom, but we do have a looming bar mitzvah. So there's always some kind of sort of social event which is in public, which seems to be on everyone's minds. It's all about relationships. No one ever does any studying, as far as I can see in any of these pieces. So culturally we all understand it. But do we feel it? Do you find is there a distance, or are we? Because it still works emotionally for me as a Brit.
I don't really know the answer to that. I think that kids of today are very immersed in American culture.
Yeah, it's everywhere, isn't it?
From TV, social media, everything. So they're probably closer to it than I am.
And certainly than I am, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You see, I can relate to it, absolutely, but it doesn't reflect my own experiences.
No.
It was a bag of cheese, onion crisps at the school disco is the closest we got to anything like that.
Yes, no, I do think it does reflect their experiences. I mean, most of them will not know what Indiana's like, but
no.
They will know, some of them, what it's like to live out in the country rather than in the
village
city.
of Splod-on-Sea or whatever. Yes, quite absolutely. That's quite. We was one post office. Yeah. Well, just bringing this to an end then, let's talk about your company. So, who are you? And why are you so ambitious?
I don't know. I think I might be mad, but and my husband really does think that. So, Captivate Theatre, I started off doing drama classes back in 2009.
Right.
I was a teacher with a long-held ambition to have my own drama company, but never thought anybody would come.
How wrong you were.
How wrong I was. So that we started off doing just drama classes in the local area, and we continue to do that, but now I do 4-5 days a week of drama classes, and then we've just expanded with our big musical productions. So our first one was we did Les Mis School Edition back in 2011. It was an MD of ours, Tommy Travers, who said we should do it, and I thought we can't do Les Mis, but we did, and that's just been brilliant for us. And this is the first year we've not been able to do it because performing rights aren't available.
Oh, really? Well, that opens doors for other shows.
It does, but it's always good to have Les Mis because it always guarantees a fantastic audience.
Because everyone comes to see Les Mis.
Everybody comes to see Les Mis, if it's done with 18-year-olds or they love it. Anyway, so that was kind of the kick-started Captivate Theatre as a fringe company. And it has just expanded since then. So we do an awful lot of youth musicals, but we also do adult musicals. So coming up after
Let's give us a run through of the day that people could, if people wanted to see Captivate from first to last of the day, what would they get? At the moment.
At the moment they'd go to the museum and they'd see Romantic Romeo, which is a show that I wrote. It's basically using Shakespeare's language, but it introduces children to Shakespeare in a very funny way, and it has original songs composed by Tommy Travers. So you should get to see one of those because they're very, very entertaining. So we start off there, then we go to the Pleasance, and Brave Macbeth, another of the Shakespeares, is on there.
You do like to keep the bard
we do,
in action.
yeah. Well, because I was an English teacher, you see, so that's
there,
kind of
it's
in there.
It's in the black, yes.
And then in the main stage here, we've got 13 at 11 o'clock. We've got all
which is here at the Rose.
At the Rose Theatre.
Rose Street.
We have got All Shook Up at 1 o'clock. We've got Bugsy Malone at 3:30, and we have Sister Act at 5:30.
That's plenty for getting on with.
And Gregory's Girl in the basement at 7.
Goodness me.
And then, unfortunately, in Scotland, the children go back to school around about the 17th of August.
It's much earlier, isn't it? Yes,
yeah.
than in England,
so
yes.
we then bring in adult musicals. And so we've got we've got Jekyll and Hyde.
The Wildhorn version?
Yeah.
Yep.
We've got Oliver, where we do have a group of kids, but I think they have permission to not be in school for when it's on. And Jesus Christ Superstar.
Gosh, and that's quite a range of shows as well, isn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah. And the Shakespeares continue at the museum and at the Pleasance, and Gregory's Girl continues in the basement till the 25th.
Well, I tell you what, I salute your indefatigability, if I may say, let alone anything else. 13 is a fantastic show. I'm going to say that I was touched and delighted.
And, thank you very much.
I'm not going to say captivating because you've already tackled that in your title, but it was an excellent show and I'd recommend anyone to see it.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. I'm glad you came.
Musical talk. There we are, Sally Lyle talking about 13. I took a friend of mine who's a fan of musical theatre, but not to any degree, as in he's a casual fan, and he adored 13. Very happy he was with it too. And so I imagine he'll be pleased with the announcement made earlier this year that it was going to be developed into a film by Netflix. So keep your eyes peeled for development news on that. Well, as I haven't seen any more shows about 13-year-old boys and girls other than the ones I've already listed, I think it probably means it's time to come to the end of this episode of Musical Talk. I do hope you've enjoyed it, and I do hope you've enjoyed the conversations I had about 13 and Bear the Musical. And remember, as I've said already, both are slated to be turned into films in the future. So perhaps we might be reviewing them again in their new formats in a much later episode of Musical Talk. Well, I think whilst we're waiting for that, it's probably time to bring this episode to an end. And you know as well as I do that the very best way of doing that is to say this word. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk was presented by Thos Ribbits, Mike Shapiro and Ellen Armstrong, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2019. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos.